I'm going to call the July 11th, 2024 meeting of the Charter Revision Commission to order. And our first order of business is the approval of the minutes from the June 20th meeting. Does anyone have any comments, questions, or would like to make a motion?
I move
Peter.
that we, go ahead.
I'm happy to move them. I also want to ask a favor of my colleagues here. I'm in between hearing aids. My old ones have died. My new ones are on order, and I hope by the next time we meet, I'll hear you better. But tonight, I might ask you to repeat or speak up.
We will do that.
All right. And in the meantime, I move to approve the minutes.
All right. Peter has moved, and tell us if verbally. Peter has moved to approve the minutes of the June 20th, 2024 meeting. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion carries 5-0. Now we're just gonna, we want to spend the bulk of the time on all the work.
7-0.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot. Thinking I'm on the select board. 7-0. Wow. Sorry. We want to spend the bulk of the meeting on the charter. You know, this great work these people did, but I wanted to just take a little bit of time to discuss the timeline going forward, because we kind of were stuck in the, what are we doing? We don't want to go through this whole thing, but I put this spreadsheet together with the issues that we have talked about, and as you notice, most of them we have not addressed. Final. Some of them are faster than others, you know, like RTM is gonna be longer. So I just wanted us to see this in the context of what we're gonna talk about with the timing. And everybody may look at this tonight and go, you forgot something or whatever, but I think it just gives us a idea of what we have to do. So that being said, at the last meeting, we talked to Bob Fisher, or asked him to get back to us on some issues about the timing. And there was the basic, if we're just gonna go to RTM, a special RTM, what would the timeline be? If we're thinking about bringing something to, if we're gonna make a change to RTM and we think we wanna bring it to the voters, there's a different timeline. Obviously, we're not gonna know if we wanna bring something to the voters until we have the RTM discussion. So there's a couple of things, and I think I'll just say what the first points, the end points are in both of those scenarios for us to get our work done. If we find out we wanna bring something for a town-wide vote, we have to have whatever that is to the select board in January of 2024. So you know what I mean? I'm sorry, 2025. Yeah, thank you for being here, Maya. So if we want to bring anything to the voters, because it would have to be voted on in the March election, and the select board will warn that meeting in January. So we need to be done with our work, you know, conceivably, it would be nice by December or latest in January.
That part of our work.
Well, that part of our work, right, that issue, whatever issue it is. If we want to get something in time to get to the legislature, Bob is saying to us that, you know, what his suggestion is, or his advice is, June 2025 is when we need to have all of our work done. So I just want people to have that in mind. You know, David and I were talking on the way down, and I don't think any of us want to drag this out longer than we have to. You know, so I think we have to start thinking about, you know, I'm assuming we want to meet in August, but that can be a decision we make tonight as well. So we just keep going. I mean, personally, I think we should just keep going if people are around in August, whatever. So, you know, the deadline for us is for anything we want to do that requires a townwide vote, we got to say to ourselves end of December. The other thing is, we got to get approval in June. So we don't have to make these decisions tonight. I mean, we want to set out and say this is the day we're going to get things done, or we want to do that in August. But I think Bob was helpful because he gave us the baseline of what we need to do. And obviously we don't have to wait till June 2025 if we want to get something to the legislature. We could still say we want to be done by December. You know what I mean? So we have the leeway, but those are absolute deadlines of if we want to move forward and get this done to the legislature so they can look at it in 2026. Does that make sense with everybody? And do we want to have a deeper discussion about this now, or do we want to have a deeper discussion about the schedule in August? How do people feel? And it's also the drafting people. I mean, you're on the hook too.
I got all of the drafting for all the changes we've already done in
Okay, good.
about an hour today, so it's
Oh,
not
good.
actually that complicated
Okay,
once
good.
you actually sit down and do it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not opposed in order to get this done and get it where it needs to go with more frequent meetings as we get closer to. They can be shorter, they can be simpler, but if it's just a matter of like, you know, every 2 weeks we got to meet and talk about the next round of revisions and keep it moving that way, it's I'm not opposed to that either.
Yeah. And for us, if we have to do public hearings and stuff. So, I mean, if we wanted to say, hey, let's get our work done by December, and then January we can deal with any public hearings or whatever we want. I mean, you know what I mean? There are options for us to move it along
And I
faster.
think one thing we could do is, you know, if we decide to go forward with the townwide vote in March, we can continue to sort of draft two parallel versions depending on the way that that vote comes out, so that we're not having to then start back up once
Right.
those results come in. Like, we can sort of have the two things running side by side, especially because it seems like even if we do keep RTM, there are some changes we would want to make, and so we can keep working on those two parallel tracks sort of simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I mean,
I think that's a good point,
Yeah.
about being able to prepare things in parallel so that we won't necessarily need a lot of time after a townwide vote in March of 2025. The one thing that might be complicated, but I think we can talk about it in its complexity, is within the RTM structure, we have these committees that we've talked about maybe we're going to make some changes or maybe we're not in the structure of those committees and the procedures around the appointments and so on. And that'll be something different if it's open town meeting than if it's RTM, likely, maybe not, but likely. So I think that's outside of that, you know, town meeting is going to do town meeting's business, whether it's RTM or not.
right,
And we can build the rest of the charter as we want to recommend it.
yeah.
But I do think that there'll be a time if we're working in parallel, when we need to give consideration to that committee question.
Yeah, and what we can do, or I can do now, is get Bob Fisher thinking about that. You know, maybe he
Sure.
can give us some guidance on, if we don't have a regular RTM, what is the role of these committees would be. So we can get all this stuff and be ready,
Good.
you know? We might as well be ready. David?
I think that we've continued to, open up the focus by flagging whatever issues there might be to be addressed here. And I have a sense that this report from Peter and Joy and Denise is probably getting close to the end of really opening up the lens. There are some suggestions, I only had a chance to look at it tonight, 2 or 3 very specific things that I saw highlighted that we'll want to talk about. The revenue, I don't want to highlight it, but the revenue generation and non-citizen voting, those were 2 things that were substantial things that would need to be addressed. I think that to the extent that we're hoping to have something done by December so that we can warn it in January for a March meeting, the time frame is actually relatively compressed right now. And I'm in favor of having an August meeting to keep the process moving. And I'm in favor potentially of being ready to turn in August to going through what's on the chart in whatever chunks you and Maya determine are appropriate for organizing the discussion and decision-making going forward, so that we can start taking pieces of the work to be done and working through decisions. So I think it's doable, but starts getting compressed to get for December. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to have it finished.
Well, and two, I think part of it is we need to make the RTM decision, because that pushes us why we have to know by January where we're gonna go with RTM, you know? And I can help, like Bob and I had a conversation about putting something together that's this is what RTM does. If we don't have RTM, how would we do it? Would it work with open? Would it work with Adjournment? And maybe I can get that thing done right away, and we can, be doing stuff that's not RTM, but then have this RTM discussion going on,
Good.
at the same time. So we move ourselves forward, if that sounds good. Because I think that's the only thing that would be pressing. If anything we want to bring to a townwide vote, we got to get it done. We have it, so we can sort of maybe work on that. And some of this stuff on this list is easy. If you guys look at it, you're going to go like, oh, that takes 2 seconds. So,
One thing I would suggest is maybe saving some of the easy sort of editorial changes to the end so that we're not constantly having to change those as we're changing
Right.
the substantive portions. Like I noticed that some of the section subdivisions are inconsistent and the gendered language and a lot of that stuff, those edits can all come sort of at the very end.
Yeah.
They don't need to be, it's something we all agree on, we have, and I don't think those are things that we need to focus on at the beginning. I think we need to start with the substantive and then work our way out.
you don't need to change them 10 times.
Right,
When you can just do
exactly.
it once at the end, yeah. All right, so in August, we'll go through this list. I'll try to see how much I can get with Bob, so I can give you an idea of how we're doing on the RTM, what, if we don't have it list. And we can move forward with that, if that makes sense. There is one little hiccup with September, that I did something and I'm not gonna be here, but I thought I could send around, I don't know if we'll send a poll or we do it at the August meeting, or we look at it at the end of this meeting or whatever, because I made a mistake and I'm going somewhere the night of that, which if I had paid attention, I would not have made those plans, because
Sorry?
I said if I had been paying attention, I wouldn't have made my plans to go somewhere on that night.
We all have lives. It's fine.
I wasn't paying attention. Okay, so
Could try to meet without you.
you could, but if you're you guys can meet without me. What was I gonna say? Okay, so August we'll be ready we'll go over this list. I'll get Bob going on the RTM stuff. And then we can go from there. Yeah.
I think that sounds great, and I'd actually like us to consider the meeting schedule next month all the way out.
Yes.
Like whether we think we want to actually, put in to our calendars 2 meetings a month
Yeah.
to, try to make this happen this calendar year. If we don't get there, we know that there's a fallback schedule that we can follow instead. But I'm in favor of that. If we don't end up agreeing that that's what we want, then we should agree at least on what is it that we do want, so that we can all lay that out. And because I think David said it well in terms of the transition from the, I think you said broad lens, the gathering of information versus now the making of decisions. Because we're moving into the making of decisions, I would be in favor of, as we look at that calendar, not feeling compelled that it be like the first and third of anything, but rather that we try to find a couple of times a month that work for everybody,
Yeah.
so that we don't have meetings when only 6 of us are here.
Yeah.
Or try not to.
Try not
have
to,
meetings when
yeah.
only 6 of us are here.
Yeah.
And if we're gonna be doing a decision-making in chunks, I think that we should try to have it as defined and planned as possible,
Yes.
so that we can give clear notice
Right.
Yeah.
to people in the community
Yeah.
that this is when we're gonna be making decisions on these issues.
Yes.
And if they have anything else to say, we really wanna hear from them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if there's any publicity we can do, any outreach we can do, we've had some well-attended meetings and some where we had Hi, Tom. You know, but it'd be nice at least
Yeah.
to know that we made that effort
Yeah,
to do outreach.
yeah. And if we can work on that in August and really set that out.
We can meet.
Yeah. Well, we can come back in August with a proposal on how we make decisions.
Perfect.
Okay. So we're all set. Is everybody else okay with that timeline discussion? The next thing is, David had volunteered and we had taken him up on it to do some writing of the powers of the people section, but we really didn't, we were unsure, or, like, we didn't give you enough guidance. So what would you like from us?
Yeah, copy for me?
Yes. Does anybody else need a copy?
No.
I just have to get it out.
Well,
What
the
page?
question,
What
we're on
are you
page 4, Article 3, Powers of the People. I don't have a proposal to make, but the general topic that arose when this issue was on the agenda before was whether the various provisions in here made sense for inclusion and continuing to be included, and whether we wanted to add a provision about a mechanism by which voters can get a matter directly onto the town meeting warning. Because that is included in the statute. I don't have my notes here, but that is included in the statute. And I expect that in almost all other towns in the state, people can get an item onto the agenda directly without having to petition select board. And here, you can get an advisory only item for inclusion, or you can get a petition to include an ordinance or to adopt town amendment to the town plan, zoning bylaws, or subdivision regs. Those are the 3 categories in the charter. And arguably, the charter trumps the statutory provision, which talks about petitioning to get an item on the warning for the town meeting. And to me, that arguably is almost more important, because if the business is going to be done, it's the ability to shape the agenda. And here in Brattleboro, you can only get on the agenda by petitioning select board for just any sort of business.
Right.
And, I mean, the language relating to adoption of an ordinance is interesting, but it's, I think, way too complex to really have any meaning to people who are petitioning.
Right.
And as to the same thing with amendments to town plan, zoning and bylaws, and subdivision regs, I understand that. But again, it's not a big ticket item. And the advisory only public sentiment article or provision here, it's interesting, but it's got no binding effect.
Right.
So, the direction we want to go, that's the inquiry. And I wasn't going to start rewriting these provisions or talk about taking one or more of them out until I had some sense what the board wanted to do, what the commission wanted to do, and whether the commission wanted to include a section about getting something onto the warning itself. That's the topic for discussion.
Yeah. So the question is, one of the big questions is, do we want to add a petition for a binding article at town meeting?
Right.
Yeah, that's like the big question, because we're adding something. Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if we leave these in, like
Yeah.
relating to an ordinance. It's- I don't know that it's ever, if you're aware that it's been used, I mean, that may have been the provision under which.
I haven't seen the ordinance used here. We did find others that have that, and we can talk about that when we're presenting. Are we going to discuss the merits of this now, or are we naming it as something we need to address?
Well, what's helpful for you? Because you wanted to start,
It has to be an agenda item.
and it is.
I've just articulated the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if we're ready to discuss it now. I've now explained it.
Yeah.
I didn't expect it to be up for discussion today.
Okay.
Once we have that decision made,
Okay.
like Hannah says, the drafting's not gonna be
Right.
inordinately difficult or time consuming.
Because I'm wondering, wasn't there did I read it wrong? Isn't there something about this in some of these other charters?
So there is. I think it's important that we warn it.
Yeah.
This and the other things in the way that David describes, so that the public knows what things we're going to talk
Yeah.
about on which nights and can
Yeah.
participate as each individual person chooses. And so I think that it's important when we warn that we're going to discuss the potential of adding in the ability of the people to put on a binding action on the town meeting warning. I think it's important that we equally warn that we're going to look at potentially changing and even deleting potentially portions of what exists.
Yeah.
We might keep it, we might change it, we might delete some of it. We're also going to consider adding this other thing.
Yeah. And
I
what
think
we-
that should all be part of telling people that what we're going to do when we look at this section.
Yeah, and what we might learn tonight from you folks can inform, I think, what we're gonna think about doing.
Yes.
In some cases.
Although, one thing I would say, a little bit of foreshadowing, I think our report is going to be very much about like the survey. You know, we did this research and we learned a lot of things and we're sharing what we learned. I think what that then becomes, with the exception of the few things where we made very specific recommendations, hopefully sort of contributes to our ability as a group to make the decisions we need to make as we go forward.
Right.
We tried not to, again, with the exception of the few things that stood out to us, tried not to be qualitative in, you know, this is really great that 37 do something versus just saying 37 do something and 17 do something else.
Right.
Just to kind of give a flavor for the differences that are out there all across the state. And there's a lot of differences, I think, is the main takeaway.
Message.
Can I ask a question? Which provision was used when we held the 16-year-old vote thing? Was it the petition for inclusion and the warning to adopt an ordinance?
No, they got it on the ballot. It was a townwide vote.
Yeah, that's right.
Remember, they got the petitions for a townwide vote.
They were gonna try to amend the charter.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because I was on the board at that time.
Yeah.
I think, David, you had just gotten off. Had you?
I wasn't on the board
Yeah,
at
I
the
was
time,
still there.
but, so this section here
That
about
was
powers of the
charter.
people,
Yeah.
Applies to
relates to,
RTM.
right, to put a warning on the article for representative town meeting to do things.
Yeah.
1, an advisory article, 2, to adopt an ordinance, 3, to amend the town plan zoning bylaws or subdivision regs. And there's a whole different mechanism to amend the charter, and
That's
what
what-
I'm hearing is
Yes.
that it was just they gathered enough signatures to say, let's amend the charter
Yeah.
to have 16 to 18-year-olds vote.
Yeah, that's what they did.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what the plan is we'll put it on a future agenda soon so we can get you working on it.
Right.
And we'll warn all this section, Article 3, these, Section 2. And so we'll put that on the agenda and we can have a conversation and then the public will know and then they can come and tell us if they have any suggestions.
And then,
Sound
so
good?
we can skip over it where you say discussion of any completed drafts, if that refers to me, because I think I did see that in an email. The only other thing that we're ready to draft, besides Hannah making the changes on things we've already decided, was I was assigned responsibility to meet with David, what's his last name?
Minor,
David Minor.
Human Services,
David
yeah.
Minor, to draft a definition and a scoping statement for the Human Services Review Committee, but
Yeah.
I seen him at the market this weekend, but we didn't have a chance to meet yet.
I think we're gonna keep
That's
putting on.
And that's gonna be some time, it'll take me
We're
some
gonna-
time to get back to that.
And I think one of the things, we keep putting that discussion of things, just so it's a placeholder, so if there's something you guys wanna say,
Right.
do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, I got nothing else to add.
Yeah,
I can say that we've started actually drafting changes in it I was, for something unrelated to this, reviewing some drafts of legislative bills, and I found that format I think will actually work best because they do numbered lines, and you sort of put at the top of each section what you're changing, and then you put it in, and so that way we're not working out of a Word document that's formatted like this. We're not like, oh, look at page 4, just say, oh, that line 13,
Yeah.
and I think that'll be a lot easier, and we can have different ones. The one we have now is just all the school board references and the capital grant review board in one, like all the changes related to that, and so we can sort of keep them separated out until we approve them, and then they can go into a final draft.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have Tom.
I guess I could mention this at the next meeting, but since
You have to
Identify yourself.
identify yourself so the people watching it can know.
hi, I'm Tom Mosikowski. It's like a commercial. So in addition, on the Secretary of State has a good webpage called Petitioning Your Local Government, and they compile what I guess one might call the non-charter statute, the base statute, I call it, where it does say that and it references the statute about petitioning requiring 5% to put it in annual meeting. But then there's also a statute referenced about petitioning for special meetings. And there's a reference to petitioning for bonding articles. And then, well, there's a petition for reconsideration of an article too. So,
There's
which we have already, okay. So, yeah, I mean, in addition to including the base statutes 5% requirement for binding articles at annual meeting, seems to me if we're considering including that in the charter, although if we don't include it, it still applies, it's just not in the charter.
Right.
So to the extent we want the charter to be like a easy, accessible manual for town residents, there are a couple other things as well.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll go to new business, which is a report from the other town charters. And I just personally want to say, I can't believe you guys, like the work you did was amazing.
Yeah.
And that you were able to do it and track it and keep it organized. Thank you. So,
you.
we're ready.
All right. I'm gonna summarize briefly what we're gonna present, like how we're gonna present to you this evening, so that you know what's coming, and then we'll go through that. And we want to share information both about how we did our work and what we learned from our work, and hope that it leads to some good substantive conversation with you and with the public. So, after I go through the how we're going to present, we will make individual observations about the experience that we had. So each of us will share a little bit about what our participation in this meant to us, and what we found interesting or concerning or otherwise about it. Joy is going to describe our process, and that's going to address both like the how and the table. You said about staying organized. We have Joy to thank for the staying organized part, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that part of the presentation. But it is a lot of material. Presenting it in a way that was actually useful, as opposed to just like, hey, we looked at 82 charters, was a challenge. And early on, Joy had the idea and then actually did the creation of this summary table that we used as the way to track our work and then to draw from to make the conclusions that we've drawn. So that was great. I'm going to summarize our findings. I'm not going to read through the report and speak to every single item, but we want to make sure we call out the things that we thought were particularly significant. And then the thing that we think is probably the most important part of what we have brought to you and to the public on this are the interesting provisions, because that's where we saw things that were written in such a way that in a couple of cases, like, oh, we don't want to do that. We want you to see what we should avoid. But in most cases, what's included in the interesting provisions is language that we thought we should give at least some consideration to. And you know from having looked at what we brought you that there's places where it's there's like multiple different ways of addressing the same topic. So we're not necessarily recommending one. We're saying that we should be giving consideration to the way that this is done differently in different places. So we'll spend some time this evening going through the interesting provisions and teeing up that more substantive conversation. And that's the place where we will speak specifically to the 4 recommendations that we are making. And then we'll wrap up and look forward to discussion and interacting with you around this as well as the public, to the degree that there's public out there who would like to.
Okay, we're ready.
Denise is going to lead us off with our individual observations.
Well, for me, I love plugging information into spreadsheets, but learning how to read through the charters was challenging. Some of the language would be kind of archaic, but learning how to kind of skim through the parts that didn't really weren't applicable to us, and then picking out the bits that I needed to put in. That was a nice learning experience. And I was also interested to find out that some villages try to act like cities or towns, and some cities or towns try to act like villages. and the amount of towns and cities that just use the default Vermont charter, Vermont statutes. Like, certain ones would have really specific things, and other ones just had some general guidelines.
And how many did you look at?
Oh, geez.
82 total.
Did you do it like divide them between yourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you didn't each look at the same 82?
We didn't. We actually, in the table,
Yeah, I
we
saw
noted
your-
our initials
yeah.
there so if you had a specific question to follow up on a particular town or
Okay.
village or city, you could know who to talk
Yeah.
to.
And I think I would echo Denise. One of the reasons why I wanted to work with Peter on this was because working on the charter for ourselves at Brattleboro was so new. So attempting to immerse myself in others, was both the opportunity and the challenge. It really took the time to sit with them all to then be able, you just really need to immerse yourself and then just stay in the zone with it. And I absolutely agree that in some ways it was a little disappointing because so many that I reviewed use just the state statutes and only had maybe like water, fire, lighting, and you're like, why did you choose those 3 of all?
Yeah.
So, and then of course the more interesting ones that had more to read through were good. But otherwise I hope personally it helps bring more context to the work that we're doing by seeing others what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And was just excited to dig into this array of charters across the state. It was something I've been wanting to do for a long time and hadn't made time to do. And then it was ideal as part of this process. I think important as part of this process that we do it. I really appreciate that we did it together. I found that, to some degree, there's a little bit of a forest and trees thing, like because I've worked with this kind of stuff for so long and I've worked with it here in Brattleboro for 7 years, it helped me to have my teammates poking at different things like, why this? And shouldn't it be that? Or, what does this mean? And so us collaborating that way sort of helped me pull back and see the forest and not just the trees. But beyond that, what was actually, really satisfying was the way in which in the division of labor, y'all were spotting things that I wouldn't necessarily have seen, and we were talking about them together as we were creating, particularly the final report, but even as we met occasionally during our work. There were things that we just saw differently, in part because we're 3 different folks, but in part because we were looking at different charters. And to me, one of the most interesting aspects of it was that you can almost see like eras when different charters were done, because there's very few, the sort of unfortunate exception of Burlington, I would mention, because it's just, we'll talk about that when we get into more of the details. So they're so detailed, like it's, probably a couple of hundred pages worth of charter. I don't know because we were looking at them online, but if it was printed, it would probably be a couple of hundred pages of just crazy detail, operational detail that doesn't, in my opinion, belong in a charter. With the exception of that one and certain sections in other ones, you see patterns, but there were clusters. It's not like there's a standard clause for, form of government that appears in 90% of them. What you'd find is there's a standard language that appears in like 15 of them, and then a variation on that appears in a dozen more, and then somebody who's a one-off, but then another, a few more that are something different. So you can kind of see how the thinking about the organization of town government, municipal government, changed over time, and then was adopted like that's the current thinking, so we're going to put that into our charter. I was disappointed about two things. One that's been named, which is that the gosh, I was actually thinking about the one that hasn't been named. I'll name the one that hasn't been named, not come back to the other. I thought we would find more provisions, greater number of provisions where we say, yes, this is great, because we've had a lot of discussion in Brattleboro, and I personally feel like it's really important for municipalities in general, and for this one, because I live here and care about it so much, that we find ways to enable the people of Brattleboro to take independent action on behalf of Brattleboro. That Vermont being a Dillon's Rule state, municipalities are very constricted compared to the authority that municipalities in some other states are able to exercise. And so I thought we would find that there were places in other charters where folks had been able to get the state to allow a significant local authority to be exercised, and we'd be able to say that's a nugget, that's one we want to plug in. We found almost none of that. There's two examples that we've shared that we'll talk about in the findings regarding fees and financial, forms of revenue other than property taxes. And that's really all we found that was, I would say, empowering as opposed to just clarifying, or being clear that in this community we're going to do this basic thing a little differently than some other communities do, and here's how we're going to do it. And then the other that was already named, that was a disappointment to me, was the number of communities that, for whatever reason, and I think there's probably some interesting stories out there about it, but adopted a charter. They went to the trouble of adopting a charter, but for such limited purposes. Instead of having it really be their local constitution, it's like the vehicle by which they participate in the local option sales tax, which they didn't need a charter amendment to do that because the state statutes empower municipalities to follow the statutory steps to adopting a local option tax. And so I found that really interesting, that there were some that had just that. There were some that did have just like one provision of a particular kind of district, where what was interesting there was that it would be a municipal district, special district, or a utility fund or something like that in the local charter, as compared to the 20 separate special districts, really truly independent special districts that we saw that have municipal charters in Vermont instead of coming under different statutes, but are not really useful for our purposes because they function so differently. Things like fire control districts and solid waste districts and those sorts of things. So so the fact that there weren't those nuggets of like, this is the best thing that we can, this is going to be really empowering for Brattleboro, and that it was kind of bewildering that there were communities that had really not developed a full charter but had adopted something very partial.
Now, can I ask a question about that? Was there any, was it geographic? Was it like the Northeast Kingdom towns that didn't, so it's just anybody?
If it was, I didn't notice that pattern. It was really all over. And we could actually, the big we here, the seven of us could dig into this in the summary table a little deeper to see, we know over in the notes section the ones that are very limited in scope. So
I was
we
just
could look
kinda-
for that, but I didn't see that.
I was just kind of interested, like, did one town do it, so like all the towns around it do it? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
was there
Yep.
somebody had some logic to it? And,
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I don't think that's true, but can't say for sure that it's not. That would be something we could take a look at.
no, it's just a fun fact, you know. That's all I was.
And so I'll speak to some of the process that was alluded to. So we did look at the charters as posted to the state government website, as noted, Title 24 Appendix. So there are 110 listed, including Brattleboro and some repealed. So obviously didn't look at those. And our focus was to just stay on the information that would be useful for Brattleboro to use. And as mentioned, that we only found a few that are. But obviously we learned quite a bit about the different structures and provisions that are in other charters. So the first layer of that, of course, is, is how they're organized. So cities, towns, villages, and then the special districts, which the special districts were not of benefit to us. And so that left 82 that had potentially something for us. So it was noted that the charters used a lot of similar language or borrowed a lot from each other, and that whatever we do, we should likely do the same because we already know what passes. And so for the process, yes, we had a shared spreadsheet where we tracked everything, and we tried to, as listening to our meetings, tried to put those columns that felt were lifted up as the most interest. I'm currently hearing more to be like, yes, we should have put what county are they in, and then what geographical region do they call themselves, right? Like, oh, that should have been a thing that we did, right? But yes, we tried to grab those columns, but of course, like, we're not repeating the charters here, right? Like, they're there for a reason. And so we did include, it was a thought to include the population from the 2020 census, so at least that can be a gauge to see what's going on. And then you'll see the reviewers' initials on the side. Most are reviewed just by one person, a handful of cases reviewed by two. And that we did meet a handful of times throughout this process to compare and collaborate on the findings. And to dig into more of the findings, we'll have Peter.
Thank you. So if you have the report open in front of you, I'm on page 2, about 2/3 of the way down is where the findings begin, and I'm just gonna move through that findings section, again, not to read this, but I would encourage, particularly for those in the public who may have an interest in digging deeper into this, to read the report. It's posted online on the town's website, and there is going to be more information in toto than what we're going to present tonight, because we're trying to focus on really the parts that are worth some more discussion among us as a commission. So the we looked at the intervals between charters, because we have that 15-year requirement, self-imposed. And what was surprising to me was that we actually only found 3 charters that have any reference to an interval at all. Everybody else just does it as, when they occasionally think it's necessary to take a look, I guess. And each of those 3, all 3 of them, have a 5-year interval. So that it's a rare thing to impose an interval, and the 3 that did impose a really short, tight time frame to it. The form of government, by far the norm for towns like Brattleboro and towns slightly smaller. So towns and cities that are above 5,000 population, the norm is council manager form of government. That's a form of government where there's an elected, basically like what we have here, or the select board being the elected policy-making body, and then a professional manager being hired to be responsible for the day-to-day operations of town government and the supervision of town staff. And there's some importance to the clarity of those roles that we'll talk about a little bit later when we look at the actual provisions, the interesting provisions section. But overall, that's the norm for communities like ours. The norm in smaller places, for those communities that are smaller than 5,000, is to have either select board form of government or village trustees form of government, where the elected body, like our select board, in those smaller communities is actually responsible not just for making policy, but also for the day-to-day operations. They don't hire a professional manager, or if they do hire a professional administrator, person that is going to be working as a job to assist in the administration of town government, that person is clearly under the structure of the government, under the charter, working under the direction and supervision of the governing body that retains the responsibility for the day-to-day operations and the staff. An important aspect of that, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole when we're talking about the whole, but an important aspect of that is the human resources administration, both for the protection and support of the employees, as well as for the ability to address situations that need correction when they need correction, and keep them out of the politics and the policy making. In the council manager form, you've got those two separate aspects, and so there's actually provisions, and we share some of them in the interesting provisions that speak to the authority of the manager in the day-to-day operations, and that the select board members are not to intervene in personnel matters and employee matters. Whereas in the select board and village trustee form, even when there is a administrator, a hired administrator present, it's actually the responsibility of the governing body to be involved and to make the decisions related to those items. So
I have some questions about all that. I'll wait until later.
I think we
Is
could.
this overview now, or, because I mean, I want to understand the distinction between council manager and select board form a little more,
Okay.
because, and you want to do that now or later?
I'd suggest we come back to it.
That's what
Let's
I'm
let's
asking.
finish the overview and then come back and dig into the things you want to dig into deeper. Sounds good. And then there's in the two of the larger places, the two largest places, and then an additional city in Burlington, Rutland, and Newport. They operate under the mayor-council form of government. That's a situation where there's a directly elected mayor that is providing that administrative leadership that in many other places are being provided by the town manager alone. We found that the timing and type of annual meeting was all over the place. The norm is, particularly among towns, is first Tuesday in March, but it's not universal. And then for villages and cities, there's actually quite a wide variety of different times that they hold their meetings. Quite a few places just do Australian ballot. Most of those places do call in their charter for what we would call our information meeting. They use some different terminology at different times, but basically a time to come together prior to voting on the ballot to discuss things, but there's no opportunity to amend. You just have a discussion, an informational exchange, and then the decisions are made by the voters on a paper ballot, usually on town meeting day, but not always on town meeting day. And then there's a couple of places, Rutland explicitly in its charter, and then a couple of other places seem to imply, but it wasn't as explicitly clear, that they don't have an annual meeting at all. That there is a place where the budget is decided. I don't remember which community we did cite it in the interesting provisions. I think it's Berry City, where it's explicit that the annual budget is approved by the city council. But there's also provisions there for special meetings to be held, and so it's a little bit confusing as to whether or not they hold an annual meeting, but it's not for the purpose of approving the annual budget. The type of governing body really aligned with the form of government, so I'm not going to spend time on that. We'll discuss that, have a deeper discussion of that later tonight. Size of the governing body, there's some variations here that might be interesting for folks, but by far the norm, especially in towns, especially with select boards, but also village trustees and city councils, there are several that have this. 5 is very normal in Vermont. There are some of the smaller places that, really, really small communities with only hundreds of residents who operate with a 3-person select board. And then there's a handful of places, usually larger but not always, that operate with 7 or even more members of the board, but 5 is very much the norm. Equally, at-large elections are very much the norm. There are 4 places that have districts or wards. So we've described each one of them as different from the others, and I'm not going to go through the details of that right now, but Barry, Montpelier, St. Albans, and Burlington, all of which are cities under, in terms of the type of designation for their municipality and the type of charter they operate under. Those 4 cities have designated wards and districts that from which the members of the governing body are elected. But even all the other cities and all of the towns and all of the villages have at-large elections. Meaning, I guess for folks at home, that the people elected to serve on the select board of the village trustees are elected by all the voters in the community to represent and serve all the voters of the community, not just segments. There's some information here about those places where there's a directly elected mayor. I think the interesting thing there is that not all the cities have one, which surprised me. And in places that do have one, there's some hybrid structure going on where they also have, there's several of them that operate with the council manager form of government, but do have a directly elected mayor. And then within village government, there's also quite a few examples of where the president of the village trustees is a directly elected office rather than being elected by the members of the village trustees. So it's interesting that in the larger and in the smaller, there was more common, at least in somewhat common, to have directly elected, top elected officials. No town of all the town charters, none, which was 51, there were none where the chair of the select board was directly elected by the people, but always, as it is in Brattleboro, has been in Brattleboro, the chair of the select board is elected by the members of the select board. There were 16 town charters that included a provision for recall for the voters to be able to follow a charter driven procedure to remove someone from elected office when they felt necessary. There were quite a few variations in terms of like the number of percentage of registered voters who would have to sign a petition to cause such a recall to happen and those sorts of things. But there were 16 towns, again, a minority of towns, but some that could show us examples of that. We have a provision in our charter now for this. None of the cities or villages had that provision. So again, an interesting distinction. There were multiple areas where we saw consistency among towns and quite a lot more variation among cities and villages both. There's some information here we presented about the appointed managers and administrators in the different types of communities. I'm not going to spend time on that. Again, we're going to come back to it for discussion around forms of government. The voter petition for binding vote, it's funny, we've already covered that amply, I think, in the earlier discussion. I'll only note, just for kicks, that I had made a marginal note for the purposes of presenting this part of our report, that this warrants discussion. Mm-hmm. Clearly, we all think so. There's quite a number of different ways in which this is addressed in those that do have this in their charters as opposed to just relying on the statute. And I think that'll be a good discussion when we get to it. It came up in one of the evenings when we were receiving input from the public that folks would like to know how many places reference their library in their charter. The answer to that is 16 out of 82, not very many. I think it's very likely that a lot more than 16 have a local library. It's just not something that is mentioned in their charter. And it was interesting to me that most of the places that mention the library in the charter, I think almost all of them, I didn't actually pull this data out, but my guess is it would be more than a dozen of the 16 reference it only for the purposes of electing the trustees of the library, not for anything about the actual operation of the library, which I thought was kind of interesting. For each of the municipalities, we have a column at the right side of the summary table that's notes, because in more than half of the cases, we found things that were interesting enough we thought it was worth noting. Didn't really fit neatly into any of the columns where we were capturing the data, but we did think that it was something that might be of interest and use to the commission and of interest to the public as well. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions, not so much for the purposes of digging deeper into the topic, but just if there's anything that's not clear about what I presented, and then we'll move into discussing findings.
Super clear
Okay.
to me. Really good.
So I'm on page 7 now as we move from the with a statement about the overall findings. So we've gone through the summary of the aggregated data that's in the spreadsheet. Here we make a observation about the overall process of coming to findings, and our first of 4 specific recommendations for the commission to consider. And this is that we found that there were the sort of annoying places that didn't say much of anything at all in their charter. We kind of wanted more and hoped for more, didn't find those all that useful. And then, equally annoying, at least to me, was the places that got, I think, too deep in the weeds. And it's not helpful both for governance when you're trying to find, when you get overly specific about things, especially when they're not about structure of government, but rather about operation of government. There's the opportunity, even for the people working with it regularly, like the select board and the staff, to run into complications where there can be inconsistencies between sections and other confusion, things that are confusing because people went to an effort to be so explicit that, 5 years on or 10 years on, that such explicit language doesn't conform to a situation that has arisen, and now we've got to struggle. Well, charter tells us we have to do it this way, but that doesn't make sense because we've got this other set of circumstances. So I think there's a tremendous risk in getting too long and too detailed, and we should strive not to do that. And I know we're not going to be one of those that just adopts some sort of one-off provision into our charter. We're going to have a charter that does more fully describe our the structure of our government. And so our recommendation, if you'll forgive my informality in my drafting of this, but it felt like it hit the mark in terms of understanding what we're talking about here, is using Goldilocks as the Goldilocks story as the guide. We want the just right mama bear version. We don't want the baby bear or the papa bear. We want to have everything that we think is really necessary to make clear for those in the government and the broader community, how our government is structured, and leave it there. Be as succinct as possible in addressing that. I'm going to talk about the sections of interesting provisions, and I'm not going to talk about the individual ones except as they relate to the other 3 recommendations we've made. We can come back to any of this that you'd like to dig deeper into, but just in the interest of time, we have general provisions related to powers and duties, related to the organization of government, related to ways in which state statutes are to be applied or not applied in communities that do have charters. There's several different examples of that. You'll see that they don't all match up. That's on purpose. These are drawn from, there are others that are like this too, but there's so much repetition from community to community. These are the examples that we drew to share, to say, it could be done this way, and it could be done this way, and it could be done this way. There's some pros and cons to the different language. I think it would be helpful to have Bob Fisher's advice on some of these items as we get making decisions and moving to specific language. There's mention here in the budget section of Barry being the place where very explicitly the city council approves the annual budget. And a footnote here, I should say too, just in terms of format, we used bracketed italics to offer comments on several of these different sections, not on every section, but on many of them, to give some flavor, to give some context to both why we have shared the information, pardon me, and also what we at least think it means to us as a commission as we get making decisions about these things. And so we clearly state here, we put this in because we found it very interesting that there's a place in Vermont that is so clear about it being the city council and not the people, not the voters. But we also, although that's common elsewhere in the country, it is not common in Vermont. I think it's one of the great things and special things about our way of doing local government here with so much voter participation. And so we don't recommend it, we just share it out of interest. To the contrary, we mentioned earlier that we're looking for provisions that would empower us to do things that might be substantially beyond what the statutes allow a municipal government to do. And we only found 2 examples, and they frankly aren't crystal clear. So they're printed here in their entirety in a almost 20-page document. I think we're 18 or 19 pages. There's about 6 pages spent just on this item so that you can see particularly St. Albans, the city of St. Albans language in its entirety, which takes 3 or 4 pages. Because in St. Albans, where they have an exhaustive list of different purposes for which they might charge fees and impose regulations, there's some stronger, broader language at the top of that section than we saw in the other charters that speaks to their ability. And I want to just not do that one from the top of my head, but say it out loud for why it's important. It says that such authority shall include, this is the authority of the city of St. Albans, such authority shall include the authority to fix and impose licenses, fees, or taxes within the limits of the city and collect the same for purposes of regulation and revenue in respect to the following matters and things. And then there's a long list of matters and things. Most municipalities under state statute and in most of the other charters are constrained very significantly in decisions around local revenue raising to specific functions, usually with some boundaries that the state places on how you determine, some instructions about how you determine the fee for certain types of activities, and limits on how much you can charge for those things. But here it's saying that the city of St. Albans shall have authority to fix and impose licenses, fees, and taxes within the limits and to collect same for purposes of regulation and revenue. I thought it was actually potentially significant. We want Bob to give us guidance on this, but that it's not just for regulation, but also for raising of revenue in the city at the city's discretion. So that looks like it might be helpful language for us. And similarly and more simply, the town of Williston charter speaks to the select board's broad authority in this area, and it says, the select board shall have the sole authority for setting of all fees, charges, user fees, or fees for services related to town government, except those prescribed in state statute relating to the office of the town clerk. So really clearly, this language actually, subject to what we might hear from Bob and where we might land together as a group, I think that the Williston language is potentially especially significant for us. First of all, it is a town, not a city. That's often a distinction without a difference, but nevertheless, it's true here. The legislature has allowed a town in Vermont to have this authority. And it's so explicitly clear, so succinct, that the select board has the sole authority for setting of all fees, charges, user fees, or fees for services for town government, except those that the state prescribes for the town clerk, not except those that the state prescribes, right? Because the state prescribes them also in quite a lot of other areas. And so I think that might be significant for us and is worthy of a lot of consideration. Which brings us to page 14 in the report. The abolition of obsolete offices. This is just one example. There were quite a lot of different, I'd say, in the ones I looked at least probably more than half a dozen, maybe more than a dozen, made reference to abolishing some of the more old-fashioned, archaic offices that have existed in Vermont over the centuries. We've had some discussion here previously about whether we ought to do that, and so this is one example. If we don't like this example, if we don't want to create our own list, if we want to see, if you want to see additional examples of how this has been dealt with in the different charters, it'd be easy for us to go back and pull some variations on this. Recall, we talked about, here's a few different examples of how other places address recall differently than we do and differently than each other. Intergovernmental collaboration. This was one that didn't appear in many charters. It did appear in some, and it seemed especially useful to me that there would be an explicit statement that the town can collaborate with other towns and other municipalities, as well as with the state and other entities in the performance of our responsibilities as a local government and service to the community. It's a common thing that there is this kind of collaboration that goes on, probably not as often as it should, but it does happen, especially between the municipalities and the state, sometimes between municipalities and each other. I thought it would be useful for us to consider these two examples, one from Hardwick and one from Williston, around making explicitly clear that Brattleboro is empowered to do this. There's some language here about separation of powers, what powers are exercised by the city council or the town or the select board versus town managers appointed in these various places, speaking to what we're going to dive into more deeply around council manager form versus the other forms. The separation of powers piece is really just offered as a example to show that there is some quite different language in different charters, but it's something that is addressed commonly in charters that do explicitly have the council manager form. Under the header town manager, we actually offer our third recommendation, which is that while it is common to enumerate the powers and duties of a town manager in the charter of towns that have one, and in some but not as many charters, it's also common to lay out provisions for the rights of the manager, basically, in circumstances where they may be getting, and their employment may be terminated. There's a fair amount of language around like the right to a public hearing and the dates, some 30 days this and 45 days that. For reasons that I'm happy to describe more fully as we get into those details another time, and think that and we collectively recommend, I think that the language around termination is not useful. I think it's important for when things are not working out for a governing body to be able to make the change. And so to have cumbersome processes that protect the manager in that moment, I think is not in the best interest of the community. The balancing act, and so one thing I would say about in terms of the things we see changing over time in terms of municipal norms is language like that was common in charters a generation ago. In the last 20 to 30 or more years, it's become very standard for municipalities that employ a professional manager to have an employment agreement with that manager, so that the agreement between the municipality and the person sets forth the terms of employment, the rate of pay, the way in which the person will be evaluated, and the raises will happen. And some often speak to the separation of powers, some other things that are clearly the obligation of the manager, and then some other things that are the obligation of the community as the employer of the manager. The those agreements are the much more appropriate way, in my opinion, to address this sort of mutual protection aspect than to have termination language in the charter, because the municipality ought to be able to have the manager they think is the appropriate person to be at the job at any given time, and not be constrained from making a change. But when those changes are made abruptly, it is the impact to the professional manager and their family is significant. So the employment agreement is the way to provide some protection, typically through a pre-approved, mutually acceptable amount of severance pay. So the municipality can terminate without notice, but the person is protected to receive some continued pay while they're moving on and looking for another job. For that reason, there are two provisions that were unique among the places that we looked at, the 82 charters. One related to the hiring of manager I'll speak to in a moment, but in the city of Montpelier, it actually says in the charter, the city council shall enter into a written agreement with the city manager establishing terms of employment, including salary and related benefits. I'm not sure that that's the exact wording we want. It's obviously not city council here, but I think adding a provision like that is, we should give very serious consideration to doing that, so that there will always be an agreement, and it speaks to those things that might otherwise be set out here, but I think would be not as appropriately addressed if they were in the charter. And then one that's just food for thought, not as strong a recommendation, but I think an interesting one to consider, is in the town of Springfield, they have a provision that the select board shall appoint with no fewer than 4 affirmative votes a town manager, requiring that there be some degree of consensus, that 4 out of the 5 or all 5 of the board members need to agree that the charter does not allow a manager to be hired on a 3-2 vote. My advice to you from the field is communities should never hire a manager on a 3-2 vote, except in the most unique of circumstances. It sets up no honeymoon. Day one of that manager serving the community is going to be in an environment where there's 2 people who didn't think they were the right person to begin with, and the dynamics of that can be really unhealthy and not good for the day-to-day operations of government, not good either for the way in which managers assist the policymaking bodies in making their decisions and fulfilling their roles. And so I think it's interesting and worth considering that there actually be a requirement that there be a supermajority to select a new manager. There are 2 different provisions related to environmental protection, one about water resources and one about stormwater management that was, I think, an artful way for communities that didn't set out whole separate utilities in their charter to still declare an authority, some power of the municipality to take action to protect the water supply and to address stormwater management. And it was really surprising to me the breadth of the North Bennington language around stormwater management, that basically they can go onto anybody's property to do what they deem necessary in order to properly manage stormwater so that it doesn't create public harm. And, with more and more frequent severe storms and flooding like just occurred last night again in Vermont, stormwater management is a very significant current and future issue in communities, and having this kind of authority sort of outside of the normal scope of eminent domain. So there is still an obligation of the municipality to make the property owner whole for whatever the municipality does to go onto the property, but it gives the unequivocal authority of the municipality to do what's necessary in order to protect the public by using the private property when it's deemed necessary for stormwater management. And finally, there's a section that we've called allowing residents who are not U.S. citizens to be registered voters for the purposes of local elections and service. we think this is particularly compelling here. There are 3 municipalities in Vermont that have chosen to enable people who reside in the city but are not United States citizens to, but who do legally reside in the United States, to participate in the local elections, and stops there actually. This language is about participating in local elections and being able to be a registered voter in those communities. And there has been some litigation over these. So this is in Burlington, Montpelier, and Winooski. There's been some litigation over this, and I don't know that it's been upheld in toto, but it has been substantively upheld. If there's been any aspects of this that have been not allowed, it's been detailed pieces. But the general idea that people who are not United States citizens but are legally residing in the U.S. and are residing in Burlington, Montpelier, or Winooski should be allowed to vote in their local elections has been upheld. And because we in Brattleboro already have modified our charter to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to not just participate in the local elections, but also serve in the locally elected offices, it feels compelling to us that we should give strong consideration to including in our charter either one of these. There's three very different ways in which these 3 communities have addressed it. So we could choose the one that looks most appropriate to us, or write our own. Even if we do choose one of these that exists, I think it's important for us to add in the language that would allow these additional registered voters to serve in local office, just as 16 and 17-year-olds are allowed to serve in local office here. So
And I should wait, but I just quick comment, and this is not a reason not to do it. The governor vetoed all these 3 charters changes in these 3 towns.
Yep.
They were overridden.
Yep.
So it's not like I'm not saying we can't do it because he's going to veto it. He'll probably veto it, but there's going to be enough people to override it. You know what I mean? I think we should think about it's not why we shouldn't do it. You know what I mean? I'm just putting it out there that
Maybe he
it's something
won't.
to mark.
Since he's lost so many times, maybe he won't veto
Well, he
it this
vetoed our
time.
16-year-old.
I know
I'm
he
just
did.
saying. It's not a reason to do it. It's just something we put on our list of.
Yes.
We might get vetoed because of it, but we can get it overridden.
Yes.
There's no reason to get.
I think that's right. The details as to like whether or not we'd be able to obtain an override obviously are dependent on lots of other elections.
We'll know in November.
So there is, I think that's a legitimate concern, and I think it shouldn't stop us from doing what we believe is the right thing. Potentially a worst case scenario outcome is we include our provision, our variation on this theme. Our whole new charter gets vetoed because of this provision. There isn't enough because of the composition of the legislature having changed. It doesn't get overridden.
Yeah.
And so then we have to go through the mechanics of extracting this and sending the rest of it back up to get approved.
Yeah.
That would be really unfortunate. In my opinion, it's worth us doing in the first instance what we believe is right and taking that risk.
Oh yeah, I'm with you. I just anything. Somebody can pick something out of anything we do when it gets to the legislature and do what they want. But we know there's just been a history of 3 vetoes. But I'm with you. We shouldn't not do it for that reason. But we just put it on our list of.
Can I just ask a practical question? So if this were to go through, it would be effectively the same ballot that the youth voters get. So
I'm sorry, a little
it would
louder.
be the same ballot that the youth voters would get. We're not like creating some new ballot that's gonna like
Yes,
make things
I
more
believe
complicated
so.
at the
We,
polls.
we should check with Hillary to make sure that that's true.
I think
but
that's something we should consider. Make sure it mirrors the youth vote language, so it's
yes,
not.
that's our expectation. That's why we think it really is a light lift decision to make because it feels
Made a note.
appropriate as a matter of fairness and consistency.
Yeah.
And we don't think it'll create additional work because there's already a ballot that is separate from the state and national offices.
Yeah, and the one question, I'll write this down to ask Hillary, is this whether, right now, 16-year-olds cannot vote on the school budget because Putney, Dummerston, and Guilford does not allow youth vote. That's probably, we have to check whether that's gonna be the same case with
Yeah,
the
I think it probably
yeah,
is.
because if they
Yeah.
don't allow it in another
Yep.
town. So it would be for the town.
Exactly.
As opposed to the school.
Which is what the language, I think that same issue exists, not in Winooski, if I'm correct, because I'm pretty sure that their school district is their
I think
city
it is
boundaries,
too.
but in the others, I think that they have that same
Yeah.
nuance.
I can talk to Hillary if you want.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm on the Board of Civil Authority that does the election, so I'm like a pretty 100% sure that it's the same as youth
Same
vote.
ballot, yeah.
Oh, but it would be.
Yeah.
They just can't, what it is, the youth vote, they just can't take the school ballot and they can take the presidential if they're gonna be 18 on election day. So it's not a different ballot, you just can't, when they come in, they get the municipal ballot, and if it's a presidential election, they get the presidential one if they're gonna be 18. They're just not given the school one. They've worked it all out.
But non-citizens would only get the local ballot.
Right. Yeah.
The very last thing we offered was just a bit lighter, a bit less heavy, a bit less technical. There were a couple of things that had jumped out to me, and one that jumped out to Denise that we've included. So the covered bridges provision is an example of, there were in other communities as well, kind of strange one-off things that we weren't really sure why they were there. They didn't seem substantively like something we'd want to bring forward to recommend. Seems like there's probably a story locally behind why that was important to them at the time that they were redrafting their charter. This particular one, speaking to covered bridges, felt like it's, very Vermonty. So, and then it just made me chuckle when I saw that the city of Burlington explicitly requires that all taxes assessed upon the grand list of said city shall be paid in money.
Do you think that's because they don't want to be paid in Bitcoin?
It may be that fresh, or it may be the opposite of, don't bring me,
Chickens.
a cow and, wagon full of hay or something. Yeah, I'm not sure what the history of it is, but I found it that funny.
Because I
And then-
don't think we want to be paid in Bitcoins.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And then the city of Rutland says that all discipline of employees and appointed officers shall be pursuant to law. So if you're an employee or officer in Rutland, you can count on only being disciplined in accordance with the law. So, that's our report. I apologize to my teammates here because I think I went deeper into the interesting provisions than we had talked about. But we did plan in this moment to each share whatever else we might want to about the things that we particularly saw and put onto this list. So I want to make room for that.
You covered it for me.
Yeah, nothing additional for me.
Okay.
That's great. All right. I know David had a question.
When I've told people that we operate with select board form of government, sometimes they don't really understand what that means, and I say town council, and then they understand it. So you draw a distinction here between, or you not just draw a distinction, but you list council manager
Yep.
and select board.
Yep.
But here in Brattleboro, for example, we have select board and town manager,
Yep.
and I assume many of the others have select board along with town manager.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if there's any substantive difference you could distinguish between council manager and select board manager.
So the direct answer to that question is no, because for the purposes of talking about the form of government, which is why we also separately talk about what type of governing body exists. So you'll see in lots of the council manager locations, lots of the council manager municipalities, there's a select board as the governing body, not a town council, right? We don't have any town councils in Vermont. And so the reason we had two separate columns is to address exactly this point. We could call it select board manager But we'd be the only place that does that. It was potentially confusing. The form of government in terms of like out in the municipal world is the council manager form of government, even when the governing body is not called a council.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Okay, so in the form of government, the council manager form of government, as it is employed here in Brattleboro and in the majority of other towns in Vermont that have a charter, is the governing body is a select board and there is a town manager. But the form of government, just because it's what it's called, if you went to School of Local Government Management and you were studying forms of government, the form of government is the council manager form of government. In this case, the council isn't a town council, it's a select board, but the function is the same as it would be if it was called a town. Well, and my personal experience actually speaks to this. When I was town manager in Palm Beach, Florida, there was a town council that functioned every bit like the select board does in Brattleboro, but it was called the town council. And so council manager made sense there as nomenclature, not just as like the proper accepted terminology for the form of government. Here, it's a little more awkward because we don't have town councils around us. We have select boards all over New England.
So in blue, under chapter 107 is Town of Brattleboro.
Yep.
And then it doesn't say anything in the line for form of government.
We didn't put anything about
Right,
anything for
but
Brattleboro. Yeah.
What you're telling me is that that's council manager.
That's right. We would, based on our charter, not just our function, but based on the powers and duties of the select board and the powers and duties of the town manager, we would be a council manager town.
And so all the towns that just say select board, for as far as you can tell, don't even have town manager.
That's correct.
Okay,
Or
thank you.
some of them you'll see out on the far right side. Some of them do appoint a town administrator, but that's where the select board would still, like, let's say that you're hiring a new employee, or let's say that we're going to talk about let's see, what would be another example? Disciplinary action is really the thing that comes immediately to mind, because it'd be a policy decision to add personnel. It'd be a policy decision to provide raises. So those would be held with the select board, even in a council manager town. But hiring of people and to some extent supervising them is done directly by the select board in those little communities that have a select board form of government. And there's actually some of those charters that speak explicitly to certain of the staff who are supervised by the town administrator, and others supervised directly by the select board.
Thank you. So that was one question I had. Should I just go on to my other questions, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, under the fees and other non-tax revenue,
Yep.
you quoted extensively or entirely from the St. Albans Charter.
Yep.
We have on page 8 through 10 a very substantial list.
Yes.
It goes through CC, so that's 29 if I count.
Yes.
And one of them's got 15 subdivisions, so that's
Yep.
like 29 plus 15, it's like 44 different powers that select board has.
Totally.
And without going through and comparing, I'm assuming that the things in the St. Albans Charter that are identified here are probably pretty similar to
Probably.
the 44 that we have listed for select board.
Yep.
So really, the distinguishing language is the first paragraph in section 18 of the St. Albans Charter, and then 8A in the Williston Charter.
Yes, versus the first paragraph in section 6 what you have called our attention to on page 8.
That just says has the power to do those things, but doesn't say to raise money to do it.
Exactly right.
So do we know whether St. Albans and Williston actually use this authority in that way?
Yeah. I can't speak to that specifically. Would be happy to find out, either individually or collectively. We can talk about how we go and do some follow-up research on this. That would be easy to learn. I have reason to believe that St. Albans does, at least in some manner, to some extent, just based on interaction I've had with the city manager in St. Albans over the years, who has spoken consistently about the importance of, when we've had conversations, for instance, at the Vermont League of Cities and Towns about the concerns that we've had in Brattleboro around local self-governance, the reaction that I often heard from the city manager in St. Albans is, maybe that's a problem for you. It's not really a problem for me. So I don't know the details. I would be happy to dig deeper into that, but that additional authority has been exercised there to some degree.
Because there is a difference between the introductory language in section 18 from St. Albans and section 8 from Williston, in that section 18's introduction also includes taxes.
Okay.
Right? So this one here from St. Albans says,
Yep.
fix and impose licenses, fees, or taxes.
Yep.
And collect the same, whereas Williston says fees, charges, user fees, or fees for services.
Yep.
Which seems much more like the authority we have inherently here in Brattleboro to charge fees for things.
We do, but often, depending on what type of fee you're talking about, there's often something statutory that says you can charge fees for this purpose, but only in this way and up to this amount or whatever. So, so I think both are worth considering, but you make a good point about taxes being also in the St. Albans language.
Then the only other thing I want to do is thank you for all the work and inquire whether you have considered, when we're done with this process. The only other thing sorry to yell at you.
Please.
The only other thing I wanted to say is that besides thanking you for all that work, because it's clearly a huge, huge project, all three of you, whether you've considered the possibility of, when we're finished with our process, trying to turn this into something more general so it's available around the state, because I can't imagine that there's been another group of people who've gone through all the charters really to look through all those materials and to compare them. And it might be a good resource for the state as a whole.
Thank you.
At some point.
Yeah, I know that's not been done, at least as of 2 years ago,
Right.
because we were looking for not having to do this ourselves.
Right.
To go and, capture the work that somebody else had done, and it didn't exist at that time. I believe it still doesn't exist, other than what we've done.
So thank you for all the work, and you might think about turning it into a resource that VLCT might use at some point.
Thanks.
Tom.
Can I stay seated?
Oh, yeah.
Can you pick me up? Okay. A couple of years ago, I was looking through all the town charters for something specific. No surprise, powers of the people, petitioning abilities. Since then, Lyndonville has been repealed. Thanks for calling my attention to that. But one specific thing for petitioning to call a special meeting.
I'm sorry, a little louder, I'm sorry.
One specific type of petition, the ability to petition to call a special meeting.
Yep.
Which I don't know actually what that looks like. I assume it has at least one article on it as part of that warning, right? Because it's not just a special meeting, article. It would seem like just a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if they're still accurate, I saw that only the Lyndonville one was repealed, but there's still, and these happen to all, so these are instances where there's not, the base statute is 5% requirement, and so these are instances where it's less than that. So, and all four of them, now three because of Lyndonville repealed, are villages. I don't know if that matters. But in the case of North Bennington, it requires just 10 signatures.
Wow.
A population of 1,716, that 10 divided by that is 0.6% of the voters of the town, not 5%. For Wells River, it requires 5 signatures. There's 431 people there, that's 1.2%. In Orleans, it's 5 signatures, 788 people, 0.6% of 1%. So unless those numbers have been changed since the 2 years.
Can you
Yeah.
send that to us? Thanks.
Sure. And then another interesting thing, and it's about, the part that's interesting to me isn't that it's about rescission or overrule of ordinances or recall, but that 3 other communities regarding those topics chose to base the requirement of signatures not just on a fixed number or percent, but based on the number of votes cast in the last annual town meeting.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, because sometimes when like 500 or 1,000 is required for something, but yet an official town turnout for an election was only twice that amount, it's like, how can you expect an individual or a group of people to muster the interest and get enough attendance for a petition? So that's just an interesting other way of having a number.
I'm just going to note that our charter allows for a certain percentage of town meeting members to request reconsideration of an article that was adopted at town meeting.
Right.
And so that's what happened when we first passed the budget that included the police fire work in it. A certain percentage of town meeting members were able to ask for the issue then to be put to ballot, as opposed to having to get number of signatures from the entire voter base.
I believe it's 50.
Yeah, that was,
Right.
I remember that was 50.
Can I offer a couple of things about that? I think, Tom, that you named something important. And in the notes section of the summary table, there's reference to several different instances where we saw that language about the percentage of the voters, so the total votes cast in the last, so it's like maybe 5% or 10%, but of the total votes cast in the last election. And at least one of those places, and I think more than one, actually went an additional layer deep in trying to ensure fairness about this idea of you shouldn't have to generate more interest than there once was, which is that if in a situation where you're going to trying to repeal something that has been done, that the threshold to get the question put out before the community is a certain percentage of the total votes cast. And then the determining factor of whether or not the thing gets repealed is whether there's more votes against the second time than there was votes against the first time. I found that really interesting that in some community they went that deep, because there is an inherent fairness in saying, you know, the community has decided to do this thing. And so if the second time around people were busy and or distracted or whatever, and a lot fewer people showed up, you know, it might be a small group of people who can undo what a larger group of people had done. And to guard against that, there's language in that provision of the charter that spoke to it having to be a larger number of votes than the previous time.
Remember off the top of your head?
I don't, but we could find it. There's by looking in the notes section, it'll be easy to pick out the handful of communities that have a more complicated system, and then we could look at those, at the details of those. So that's one thing. And the other thing I would say is I had the same concern that you expressed around what does it really mean to have the ability to call a special meeting. That language appears in quite a few different charters, and we didn't offer it up because of that ambiguity. If you know what we were looking for was the threshold that was embedded in these charters for how to get a binding article before the people, right? That's what we had been discussing here as a board or a commission, and that's what we went looking for when we looked at these charters. And so we didn't have a column that said, you know, can the people call a special meeting? But you know, I thought the same thing as I was reading through these various charters of why would you have language about calling a meeting if you have language about the binding provisions, right? It's the binding provision power that matters, because you wouldn't ever call a meeting for no reason.
Isn't a special meeting something that's allowed under statute, so that's probably why it's referenced?
Potentially, but if it's allowed under statute in the same ambiguous way that it shows up in these other charters, I would suggest that it'd be good for us to have that section of our charter not have that ambiguity in it, but be clearer about under what circumstances the petition for binding vote might go to a special meeting rather than a regular meeting.
And what I'll note here is that under powers of the people, the initiative provision talks about including the item in the warning. The adoption of an ordinance talks about it being in the warning. But the petition to bring a vote of the town, a proposed amendment to the town plan, zoning bylaws or subdivision regulations, that does not contemplate it going on an existing warning. But it appears to be the one situation where a special meeting might be contemplated.
Okay.
So if people gather enough signatures to petition to bring a vote of the town on a proposed amendment to the town plan, zoning bylaws or subdivision regulations, that may by definition, unless there's a new town meeting, an existing town meeting already come up, that might have to be on a special meeting. Because there's a time frame with it as well.
Right.
I found this really helpful. Now I have to go and compare it to what we've got. Do you know what I mean? It's like compare.
There
Right.
are more
This-
things to talk about
Yeah.
once we've
Yeah, it's
seen
really,
your report.
it's really helpful. And I think, I was just thinking about the revenue thing and hoping, because it came up it's come up before, but it came up again at the Tuesday night select board meeting from Dick DeGray, who brought it, it's on our list, that the town would collect the entire local option sales tax ourselves and not send it to the state. So it's kind of like, oh, did anybody else do that? It doesn't appear
No,
to.
and that was a surprise to me based
Yeah.
on some of what got discussed back during the time when that decision
Yeah.
was being made. I thought we were going to see in the cities, maybe Burlington, maybe Rutland, maybe St. Albans, because I knew they had some broader authority, something that was clearly a local tax, not a local option tax.
Yeah.
And there were no examples of that. There are in both, I'm going to say both Rutland and Burlington, but that might not be true. In several of the cities, there was reference to local option sales tax in the charter, but as explicitly adopting it under the state statute that applies, which means it's collected by the state and remitted to the town. You only get 2/3 of it. All the
Right.
same stuff that happens for the towns
Right.
is how I saw it in the city charters. I didn't see any city charter that spoke to it being unilateral and administered and 100% collected
Right.
by the city.
Right. Oh, Patrick.
Peter, I believe you're correct about that. The enabling statute that provides for local option sales tax also explicitly describes the how the state and the municipality will share that. So that really isn't going to vary by municipality. In Burlington, I do recall when we were looking at the local option sales tax, I don't know, 7, 8 years, however long ago it was. Burlington has a gross receipts tax, and that is collected locally
Okay.
by the city of Burlington. It has nothing to do with the state. And I remember at some point in time seeing from what sort of like arcane portion of their charter that they derived that
It
authority
must be
from.
pretty arcane because it doesn't speak explicitly, or I missed it. because I did that review and I was looking for it. I wanted to find the way in which they exercise local revenue raising authority, and I didn't see it there.
I'll see if I can dig that up.
Yeah.
I remember having a conversation with the folks up in Burlington because, for years you've heard folks talk about, hey, we need to get a greater share of the revenue of local option sales tax, and look, Burlington does it. And so,
Right.
we had lengthy conversations with Burlington. Burlington said, no, in fact, we don't. We get the same, roughly 2/3, 1/3 that everybody else does on the local option sales tax, but we do have
Yeah.
what's called a gross receipts tax.
Got it.
And so,
Okay. Yeah.
let me see if I can find
Poke at that some more.
Yeah, because I was getting out, when I read this, I thought, oh, it's gonna answer to our prayers, we're gonna have the language, and then I'm like, they don't say anything about that, so. Good. All right, this has been great, does anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry, Hannah.
Is it possible, did you look into whether or not this does not exist because it's been overridden every time a town has tried to present it?
No, we didn't look at legislative history
Like,
on these
I
things.
have to imagine that we're not the first town to have considered this, and I have to imagine there's a reason it doesn't exist anywhere.
Yeah.
Well,
Like, it's not that no one's hasn't thought of it, like.
yep. So that's why I thought the Williston and St. Albans language was so significant, is because the legislature has approved this language for those two places. It is entirely possible. A lot of other places have asked and been told no. I think that's not likely. It is entirely possible. It was very disappointing to me when we were leading an effort in the statewide conversation among municipalities for more local control. It started as actually something that David and Kate and others were working on before I came to town in 2015 regarding regional hub communities. So, Brattleboro being the place that has sort of, a special vitality, but also lots of special responsibilities to the region. And there's costs associated with that aren't borne by the region. So there was an effort underway to get some state action that would make that a fairer situation. It grew between like 15 and 17 into to try to draw more support for it into a broader local empowerment, local government empowerment effort through the League of Cities and Towns to generate villages and towns and cities together saying to the legislature, you need to allow us more authority to operate as is common in other states. There are only 9 states out of the 50 at this point that are what are called Dillon's rule states, that we're handcuffed except when there's explicit permission. In the other 41, municipalities it's home rule, and they're allowed to do anything that's not prohibited by statute. Some of the home rule states prohibit a lot of action by statute, so it's not a panacea, but it's a better system for municipalities, and there's a lot more local authority in general across the country. So we were trying to generate momentum for that kind of conversation to be held at the legislature. We actually did hold it. Jeanette White proposed some legislation. We gave testimony. There was some organized effort around it, and it was very disappointing to me how it was us and about less than a dozen other communities that were willing to put energy into that effort. Most places are like, the statutes allow what they allow, and then we know what the rules are. And there wasn't a lot of interest in trying to push that boundary out. So it's possible, for sure, that people have asked and been told no, but I think it's worth us putting in whatever language we think is appropriate, whatever additional authority we think Brattleboro should be able to exercise, whether that's in the select board or in town meeting. Put it in there, and again, kind of like with the governor's vetoes on the non-citizen voting, we see what happens with it. And we're able to point, in the moment when we go up and try to defend our recommendations to the legislature, we're able to point to 2 municipalities. As long as Bob, I think the linchpin, we didn't go to Bob while we were writing and say, hey Bob, does this mean what we think it means? So we need his input on this, but as long as he doesn't say, hey, nice try, but as long as we don't land there, then we'll be able to defend our ask for that boundary to move by saying, you've done it for 2 others. You ought to do it for us.
Thank you. Now we'll go and compare and lots to compare.
We have to add a bunch of stuff to your list
Oh,
of
yes.
things to talk about.
Yeah, I'll add the stuff that we've been talking about here to the big giant
Thank you.
list. Yeah.
I guess I hope it's more evidence of,
Oh,
right, and support for the topics. I imagine a lot of the topics are
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Some of them are, some of them aren't.
Yeah. And it's things, to me, it's things that I would, if they seem obvious when you look at them, but we just haven't thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So that's why I like this a lot. I like it a lot. So I'll merge it, I'll put some of the stuff in that list, and then, I think we talked about August will come with a
Yeah, Kate and I will
timeline.
come and talk about how to split up discussion.
Yeah, and we'll put the powers of the people thing on if we can do it. I don't know, do we wait, if we want a crowd, maybe we wait till September, because everyone could be on vacation. So we'll put that on for September.
Okay.
We'll come up with a, August agenda that will get something done to push us forward,
Yeah,
because that's our goal.
so can I talk about dates?
Yes.
Since you can't,
Well, did we go to talk about dates in August?
no,
Did-
we're meeting on the 15th, right?
Oh, yeah, but I thought we were gonna sort of sit in one of these meetings and go, do we need to meet every 2 weeks and then put the dates aside, or do we wanna talk about that now?
Yeah,
Do you
I
guys
thought
wanna
what you
talk
said
about it
earlier
now?
was you would come next time with a proposed schedule for how we're gonna pick up the pace and get from here to the finish
Yeah, and
line.
what we're gonna do.
And then we're all gonna work with that to say, oh, that one doesn't work for me,
Right.
can we adjust it?
Yeah, but Kate can't be here on the 19th of September. So I was
15th,
going,
is it the 15th is what you're saying? That would be the Thursday.
did I look at the wrong date?
No, I think you got the right date.
19th is Thursday.
19th is
Yeah.
September, no, she was talking
September.
about August.
August.
No, 19th.
September.
Is it September you
We're
can't be
talking
here,
about
or August?
September.
No, September.
September.
She can't come
Yeah.
in September.
But do we wanna set that date in August when or do you wanna set a new date now?
No, I think we can do it in August when we look at all of them, because then it could be if there's 2 or 3 in
Okay.
September at
We
that
could-
point,
yeah.
right?
We could
Like
do that, but I was
like-
gonna that's fine, we can wait, but I'm one
Especially
of the
once the
people,
roadmap is.
I'm one of the people that likes to have my calendar in advance, so I don't put things in that conflict. So. But that's fine, we'll meet on the 15th of August.
Yeah, and we'll put a roadmap and we'll have, as Hannah suggested, maybe more than one date in a month, so I'll have them set aside and we can
Yeah.
just whip through this.
Yeah, the 12th and the 26th. Are you back the 26th?
No. Okay. All right, so I think we're done our business. Does somebody want to make a motion?
I move to adjourn.
All those in favor? Aye. Thanks, everybody. We'll do a lot of work between, and thank you guys so much.